Imagine waking up to discover that the invisible foundations of your life, the cost of the coffee in your hand, the stability of the company that pays your mortgage, the very rules of the world you thought you understood, have been rewritten overnight by a single signature in a distant capital. This is not just a story about numbers on a ledger or containers on a ship. This is a story about the soul of a democratic state. It is a chronicle of how a nation understands its own identity, how it reacts when the world begins to squeeze, and how its people maintain their dignity when their economic and civic assumptions are pushed to the breaking point. What we witnessed, in the most basic terms, was the United States choosing to dramatically escalate tariffs on Canadian goods. They invoked a high-stakes argument regarding national security and economic fairness, a debate that has been simmering in the background of North American life for decades. Canada, a nation finding itself positioned next to a neighbor whose economy is so massive it effectively dwarfs its own, did not simply fold. They responded with a calculated series of tariffs of their own. That was the official narrative, the one you saw in the headlines. But what actually unfolded beneath the surface was a profound test of institutional muscle. When a government chooses to impose tariffs, they are doing something far more radical than merely adjusting a price point. They are placing an immense artificial stress on the connective tissue that binds modern economies together. For you as a citizen, this matters deeply. Even if you have never set foot in a factory, never worked in a shipping yard, and never studied the complexities of international trade, the consequences of this friction ripple outward until they touch every corner of your life. They influence the price of the food on your table, the long-term security of your job, the value of your retirement savings, and perhaps most importantly, your quiet sense that the world functions according to a set of predictable, reliable rules. I believe that this predictability, the simple knowledge that tomorrow will operate much like today, matters more to the health of ordinary civic life than any single policy dispute could. Trade conflicts do not just materialize out of thin air like a sudden summer storm. They are the result of slow, grinding accumulation. They are shaped by decades of quiet disagreements over government subsidies, the fine print of market access, and the diverging regulatory philosophies of two different nations. The United States and Canada have navigated these waters for generations, sometimes with visible friction, but often with a remarkable spirit of accommodation. The modern arrangements that so many of us rely on for stable prices and open borders were not created by accident. They were built carefully, brick by brick, across both Republican and Democratic administrations in the U.S. and across multiple Canadian governments with vastly different economic strategies. This was a bipartisan, multi-generational project. So, when a sudden tariff shock arrives, it doesn't just hit the market. It collides with all of that accumulated history. It asks our institutions to make a choice. Will they bend under the pressure or will they hold firm? As you may have noticed, people in both countries were left asking questions that go far beyond the realm of economics. They were asking whether a system built on shared rules can actually endure a moment of intense unilateral pressure. Now, if you are wondering how these tariffs were actually pulled from theory into reality, the answer is found in a potent combination of statutory authority and executive discretion. The American president possesses a toolkit of powers that allow tariffs to be imposed with incredible speed, often bypassing the traditional, slower involvement of Congress. This is especially true when national security is invoked as the justification. That specific mechanism was originally designed to allow a country to respond rapidly in extraordinary life-or-the-death circumstances. But like many powers created with one specific crisis in mind, it can be repurposed for an entirely different scenario. When that happens, the rest of the democratic system must scramble to adapt to this new reality. On the Canadian side of the border, the response operated through its own set of established, rigorous processes. They moved forward with retaliatory measures that were designed to be proportional, highly targeted, and strictly consistent with international agreements. It is vital to recognize that institutions at their core behave according to incentives, not emotions. They respond to pressure using the specific tools they have been given, even if the rhetoric surrounding those tools becomes incredibly heated and personal. The central figures in this conflict, from the American president to the Canadian prime minister, were not acting in a vacuum. They were operating within a political environment that was shaped by their own voters, their own constituencies, and their own constraints. A leader who has built a brand on promising protection for domestic industries must appear decisive and strong when he believes those industries are under threat. Conversely, a leader who presides over a smaller but deeply interconnected economy must go to great lengths to reassure his citizens that their national autonomy is not at risk. These are not merely economic decisions, they are political and symbolic declarations of intent. When you hear leaders assert their strength or call for calm in the face of disruption, they aren't just speaking to the stock markets, they are speaking to the very heart of national identity. As someone who cares about democratic norms, I think you should pay very close attention to that part of the story. The way a leader speaks during a crisis often reveals far more about the health of a democracy than the policy itself does. What makes this entire episode so consequential is not just the specific dollar amount of the tariffs, but the larger implications they carry for institutional trust. Every time a major economic relationship is destabilized, even for a short time, it changes how citizens perceive their governments, their alliances, and the international order they once assumed would remain stable forever. That perception is everything. It influences how people vote in the next election, how a small business owner decides to invest their life savings, and how entire communities plan for their future. And yet, when a nation like Canada absorbs a shock of this magnitude and continues to function without collapsing, you begin to see the outlines of a system that was built with real redundancy and flexibility. It shows that the design can withstand a certain amount of turbulence. As we move further into the mechanics of this story, it becomes clear that this confrontation reveals something essential about how modern democracies function under extreme stress. Tariffs might be blunt, crude instruments, but the systems they activate are anything but simple. Bureaucracies on both sides of the border must engage in a constant high-stakes assessment. Which industries can absorb this pressure and which will break? They must anticipate how millions of consumers will react to a price hike, how global supply chains might reroute themselves to avoid the friction, and how long political leaders can maintain a specific posture before the public's patience finally wears thin. You might think of this as a kind of civic engineering. When a bridge is tested by an unexpected massive weight, we finally learn whether its designers accounted for the pressures that real life inevitably imposes. In this case, the bridge held. It didn't hold because the shock was small. It was quite large, but because the underlying design was sturdier than the loudest, most pessimistic voices assumed it to be. The key actors in this episode were following specific strategies. The President of the United States pursued a path he believed would fundamentally reset trade arrangements that had been in place for years. His advisors framed these tariffs as necessary corrections to structural imbalances that, in their view, had disadvantaged American workers for too long. Meanwhile, the Canadian government had to look beyond the urge for immediate emotional retaliation. They had to think about the long-term architecture of their economy, which depends on global networks of trade rather than a single point of leverage. That required a specific kind of courage, the courage to resist both panic and escalation. It meant treating the moment not as a crisis of who they are as a people, but as a test of whether their institutions could continue to do their jobs. These are subtle distinctions, but they matter enormously. The difference between reacting emotionally and responding institutionally often determines whether a conflict stays manageable or becomes a disaster. I suspect you might be wondering who is ultimately responsible for this. How should we allocate blame or credit? The truth is that responsibility rarely falls neatly onto one person or one office. Political rhetoric loves to simplify things into good guys and bad guys, but reality refuses to be that simple. Leaders are responsible for their decisions, certainly, but they are also products of the political incentives around them. Bureaucracies are responsible for the way a policy is carried out, but they are constrained by the legal frameworks they work within. Markets respond to signals, but they do so according to their own internal logic, often ignoring a leader's original intentions. When a nation experiences economic turbulence, it is very tempting to search for a single villain to hate or a single hero to save us. Yet one of the habits of mind I hope this channel encourages is the willingness to examine the entire system before reaching a final judgment. What happened next carries implications that go far beyond the price of steel or lumber. When a significant economic strain occurs, citizens begin to reevaluate every assumption they have about stability. Some begin to wonder if old alliances are as strong as they once seemed. Others start to question if the global trading system still operates according to any predictable principles at all. And many others feel, perhaps quietly and privately, that they have far less control over their own economic destinies than they were led to believe. If you have felt any of those instincts lately, you are not alone. Those feelings are not a sign of weakness. They reflect the deeper currents of political life in the 21st century. We live in an era where a national decision made in one room reverberates instantly across borders and into our homes. This confrontation between two neighbors illuminated just how interdependent we have become and just how fragile that interdependence can feel when it is placed under deliberate strain. The human dimension of this story deserves far more attention than it usually gets in the news. While economic models are great at capturing broad trends, they are terrible at conveying what it actually feels like for a factory worker to lay awake at night, wondering if their overtime shift will evaporate next month. They can't capture the stress of a small business owner seeing the cost of imported components suddenly spike, threatening a business they spent 20 years building. These are not abstract variables in an equation. These are real lives with mortgages, families, and daily routines that depend on stability. When institutions weather a crisis, it is because individuals adapt in ways that are often overlooked by the cameras. They find alternative suppliers when the old ones become too expensive. They work longer hours to cover the gap. They choose to stay calm even when the markets are fluctuating and when leaders are arguing on television. In that sense, what we call institutional resilience is actually just the cumulative reflection of human resilience. I think that is something worth recognizing and honoring, especially when the public discourse becomes heated and divisive. Yet, even in the middle of all that stress, something else emerged. A reaffirmation of the idea that democratic nations possess internal strengths that aren't always visible when things are going well. Canada, facing a level of pressure that many believed would cause severe, permanent damage, relied on a combination of social trust, steady governance, and economic diversification. The result was not a loud triumphalist victory, but something much better: steadiness. In political life, steadiness is tragically underrated. You will always hear dramatic declarations about sovereignty or economic warfare, but the real grueling work of national survival is usually quiet, incremental, and incredibly methodical. It unfolds in boring committee rooms, in the offices of regulatory agencies, and in the daily discipline of citizens who continue to participate in civic life even when the headlines suggest a storm is coming. As the months unfolded, it became very evident that the initial predictions of a total collapse were overstated. That isn't unusual. Forecasts are almost always shaped by the intensity of the moment they are written in. But what matters more than the prediction is how the institutions actually behaved when the pressure was at its peak. They did not fracture. They adjusted their sails. They communicated with the public transparently. They emphasized the importance of long-term planning. By doing so, they demonstrated that a democratic society's greatest asset is not its ability to avoid every crisis, but its capacity to manage a crisis without losing its sense of proportion or its sense of purpose. As I continue to reflect on this period of history, what strikes me most is how the confrontation revealed the deeper, inescapable logic of economic interdependence. When nations that share thousands of miles of border and a deep set of shared values find themselves abruptly at odds, The mechanics of separation are never as simple as a politician's speech makes them sound. Supply chains do not realign themselves overnight just because a law was signed. Communities that have relied on cross-border trade for a century cannot simply reimagine their entire existence on command. And you, as someone living within an economy shaped by decisions made far beyond your immediate control, experience these shocks not as grand strategy, but as small, annoying, or painful adjustments to your daily life. This entire episode serves as a reminder that globalization is not just a philosophy or a political talking point, it is an infrastructure. It has physical weight, and it has massive inertia. That is why tariff conflicts, even when framed in the most dramatic language possible, usually unfold more like slow-moving tremors than sudden world-ending earthquakes. Yet, beneath that caution lies the reality that leadership decisions still matter deeply. The American president chose a specific path aimed at reshaping trade balances through the use of pressure. In doing so, he activated both the deep loyalty and the profound concern of his supporters. Many of them believed these measures were a necessary, overdue medicine to revive domestic manufacturing. Others feared those same measures would disrupt industries that had been stable for decades. Meanwhile, Canada responded through its established institutional channels, offering a specific brand of calm rhetoric paired with very targeted countermeasures. That blend of firmness and restraint conveyed something vital about how a middle power survives in a turbulent world. It illustrated that sovereignty in the modern age is less about who has the most sheer force and more about who has the most strategic resilience. And I think that is a lesson worth carrying with us as all democratic societies continue to grapple with a world that is only getting more complex and more geopolitical. Much of the commentary during the height of this dispute missed a key dimension: the way democratic norms themselves function under stress. When a leader invokes national security as a justification for an economic action, it is very tempting for legislatures and courts to simply step back and defer to the executive. That is actually part of the constitutional design in many places. But it also means that the responsibility shifts to the citizens. You must pay closer attention when those powers are used. You might have noticed that the debates over these tariffs expanded very quickly into much bigger questions. People started asking about the limits of executive authority, the reality of congressional oversight, and the dangers of unilateral decision-making. These are not abstract law school debates. They are the debates that shape the rules that will govern the next crisis, and the one after that, long after the current leaders have left office. If you are someone who values a system where power is distributed and checked rather than concentrated and absolute, these are the questions that deserve your focused attention. There is another aspect of this episode that I think deserves more deliberate reflection: the narrative we build around national character. Commentators love to use easy stereotypes. They describe Canada as polite, cautious, or deferential. They describe the United States as bold, assertive, or confrontational. While these caricatures are convenient for a 30-second news clip, they obscure the reality that both nations are incredibly complex. They both have traditions shaped by centuries of history, unique geography, and specific institutional designs. Canada's response to the tariffs showed the world that restraint should never, ever be mistaken for weakness. Simultaneously, the United States' use of strong rhetoric demonstrated that being assertive is not always a sign of instability. It can be a calculated tool of negotiation. When we reduce entire nations to simple personality traits, we lose our ability to understand why they are doing what they are doing. As a viewer thinking about the future of North American cooperation, you will find it much more useful to set aside the stereotypes and look at the actual incentives that guide the leaders on both sides of the border. When we step back and look at the wider consequences of this confrontation, we have to recognize that it affected much more than just the trade between two countries. It sent powerful signals to allies, to competitors, and to international institutions all over the globe. It raised a fundamental question: can long-standing agreements withstand an abrupt change in the political weather? For nations watching this from Europe, Asia, or South America, this dispute was a case study. It was a test of how a rules-based order copes when one of its main architects decides to change the rules. Some observers saw this as a warning, a sign that even the most stable alliances in the world can fray if you pull on the right thread. Others saw it as a massive confirmation that the frameworks we have built are actually much sturdier than they appear. If you are wondering which side is right, the answer is likely that both are correct at the same time. That is the nature of political life in a democracy. Multiple conflicting truths exist in a state of constant tension. The economic consequences were not the same for everyone. Certain sectors of the economy had to absorb substantial, painful losses. Other sectors adapted with surprising speed by seeking out new markets they had never considered before. Some businesses even found that the shock forced them to innovate in ways they had been too hesitant to try during the easy years. For the workers on the ground, the outcome depended entirely on where they lived, what industry they were in, and whether their local government was prepared to support them. These differences serve as a vital reminder that national statistics, while useful for economists, can often hide the incredible human diversity underneath the numbers. When you hear on the news that an economy grew or shrank by 1%, that number doesn't capture the full spectrum of lived experience. It doesn't show the person who lost their job, nor does it show the person who started a new successful company because of the change. This is why I believe any discussion about trade or policy must always include a healthy dose of empathy, even when the technical arguments are complex. People build their entire lives on the assumption of stability. When that stability is taken away, the consequences are deeply personal. As this dispute persisted, it also revealed the surprising strength of democratic feedback loops. Citizens in both countries didn't just sit in silence, they voiced their concerns to their representatives. Business groups provided detailed, data-driven analyses of how the tariffs were hurting their employees. The courts were asked to examine the legal justifications for the measures being taken. This wide-scale civic participation didn't magically make the conflict go away, but it did shape its direction. It ensured that the decisions being made weren't just happening in a vacuum in an executive office. If you ever find yourself questioning whether your own voice actually matters in a system this large and complex, episodes like this should serve as a reminder. Democratic pressure doesn't always look like a massive, dramatic gesture. It often operates quietly through sustained engagement and the refusal of citizens to look away. As the dust from this confrontation finally began to settle, what emerged was not a simple tale of a winner and a loser. It wasn't a story of a dramatic victory or a crushing defeat. Instead, it was a portrait of institutional steadiness under extreme strain. That isn't the kind of story that gets a lot of clicks or views in its early days because it isn't explosive. But it is exactly the kind of story that is worth examining when you want to understand how a democracy actually endures over the long haul. You might remember the headlines from the beginning, the ones that predicted a total collapse of the relationship or a permanent rupture between neighbors. Yet when we look closely at the weeks and months that followed, we don't find a collapse. We find the quiet, boring, essential operations of a system designed to absorb pressure, to channel disagreement into productive paths, and to protect the long-term interests of citizens who just need their governments to act with a shred of responsibility. That might not be an exciting story, but I find it to be a deeply reassuring one. The broader democratic lesson here is that we often confuse national strength with dramatic, loud gestures. But the United States and Canada both proved in their own unique ways that the deeper strength of a political community is found in its habits. It's found in the habit of restraint, the respect for established rules, and the commitment to keeping processes predictable even when a leader is tempted to push the boundaries of their power. As a participant in a democratic system, you live inside those habits every single day. They shape your economic prospects, they define your social environment, and they provide your sense of political belonging. When those habits hold firm under pressure, they reaffirm the civic foundation that allows a society to argue fiercely, and we certainly do argue, while still functioning as a single unit. There is also something important to be said about the role of human agency within these massive institutions. Policies are not just words on a page, they are drafted and managed by civil servants who choose to maintain their professionalism even when the future is uncertain. Businesses don't just adapt automatically. They do so because owners and managers make difficult, brave choices. Workers continue to produce, to invest in their skills, and to plan for their children's future, even when the news is discouraging. The resilience we often attribute to the system is actually just the combined behavior of millions of people who wake up every morning and choose steadiness over panic. If you ever feel like your own actions don't matter in the grand scheme of global politics, remember that national stability is nothing more than the sum total of private responsibility. When we finally step back from the specifics of this trade war, away from the tariffs, the supply chains, and the heated rhetoric, the deeper story becomes clear. This episode revealed a structural tension that sits at the very heart of every modern democracy, the tension between the human desire for rapid, decisive, powerful action and the systemic need for slow, predictable, rule-governed processes. Every democracy navigates that tension in its own way. The United States often leans toward executive energy, favoring the ability of a leader to move fast. Canada often leans toward institutional continuity, favoring the stability of the process. Neither approach is perfect. Both approaches rely entirely on the ability of citizens to hold their leaders accountable, while still trusting the system enough to let it do its work. You may strongly disagree with the choices that were made on either side of the border during this conflict. That disagreement is healthy, but the most important thing is that the mechanisms for contesting and adjusting those choices remained intact throughout the crisis. They didn't break. There is a popular tendency in our political discourse to treat events like this as evidence of an inevitable decline. Some people will look at this trade dispute and say the international order is unraveling. Others will claim we are just reverting to old, primitive patterns of rivalry. While those views might contain fragments of truth, they overlook a much more encouraging possibility, that democracies, even when they are strained to the limit, continue to reveal a capacity for adaptation that authoritarian systems simply do not have. The ability to debate a policy, to recalibrate a response, and to reassess a strategy without descending into total paralysis or violence is one of the greatest strengths of democratic life. If you are thinking about how your own civic engagement fits into this, remember that this is a strength that you help sustain every time you pay attention, every time you ask a question, and every time you demand better from your institutions. To close, I want to return to the idea that headlines often hide more than they show. The story you saw on the news probably looked like a showdown. It probably looked like it was all about personality, willpower, or political theater. But the deeper, more important truth is that this moment was defined less by the confrontation itself and more by the endurance of the norms we have built together over many decades. It showed us that nations can absorb a massive amount of friction without abandoning the core principle of cooperation. It showed that our democratic systems, as imperfect and frustrating as they can be, still possess remarkable reservoirs of stability. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that when citizens take the time to understand the structures beneath the surface, they gain a much clearer sense of their own stake in what happens next. So, I want to leave you with a question to consider. What kind of institutional resilience do you want your own society to cultivate in the years ahead? And in your own way, how will you contribute to making it a reality? If you found this exploration of trade and democracy useful, I invite you to stay engaged with this channel. Share your thoughts in the comments and continue exploring how the intersection of politics, history, and our institutions shapes the world we all live in. Conversations like this are how we all learn to think more clearly about the systems we depend on and the responsibilities we all share as citizens.